So what was the cause of the devastating explosive failure that happened to the World Trade Center?
Secondary explosions and then subsequent collapses.
We heard reports of secondary explosions after the aircraft impacted.
The entire building has just collapsed, as if a demolition team set off. When you see the old demolitions of these old buildings, it folded down on itself.
Anybody who's ever watched a building being demolished on purpose knows that if you're going to do this, you have to get at the under infrastructure of a building and bring it down.
Like, it sounded like gunfire, you know, bang, 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 and then all of a sudden, 3 big explosions.
At 10:30, I tried to leave the building, but as soon as I got outside, I heard a second explosion and another rumble and more smoke and more dust. I ran inside the buildings, the chandelier shook, and again, black smoke filled the air. Within another 5 minutes, we were covered again with more silt and more dust. And then a fire marshal came in and said we had to leave because if there was a third explosion, this building might not last.
There was a heavy-duty explosion.
Secondary explosions and then subsequent collapses.
The full impact was seen in the moment in time. My colleague Stephen Evans, who was in the Trade Center and was interviewed just after the first explosion.
There was another big explosion in the other tower. Flames coming out in this billowing grey smoke. People still not panicking. People not quite understanding what was going on. Then somebody said that they saw an airliner going to one of those towers. Then, I don't know, an hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower. I don't know what on earth caused that. The thing that strikes me is, one, the terribleness of the incident, whatever the cause. We don't go into politics, but whatever the cause, the terribleness, the hugeness of what's happened. So huge, in fact, that most of the people around simply can't understand what happened. People were just standing around, talking to each other, nodding their heads. Oh my God. We gotta go. We gotta go. We gotta go. Oh my.
Although the September 11th attacks were almost 5 years ago and the 9/11 Commission report has been released for some time now, some folks are still asking questions about what happened that day. A Zogby poll commissioned just last month by 911truth.org found that a whopping 42% of Americans think the government and the 9/11 Commission are covering something up. Michael Berger, 911truth.org press spokesperson. Welcome to Scarborough Country.
Thank you, Michael.
What's the one element that you think folks in Scarborough Country will say, holy smokes, I didn't know that?
Well, I had asked your producer if you would play a clip of Building 7, for example.
We will. Here you go. Tell us what we're about to see.
Well, I can't see the clip, but what you're seeing is Building 7 was north of the World Trade Center site. It was damaged in the collapse of the North Tower on its south face. It was a 47-story tall, 570-foot tall building, and yet even the FEMA report in the investigation of the collapse of that building, again, was never hit by a plane. Collapsed at 5:20 in the afternoon on September 11th.
But it was in such close proximity to the Twin Towers. I mean, surely it paid a price because it was...
Absolutely, Michael, it did. However, again, the NIST investigation said that the damage from the collapse of the North Tower took out structural columns on the south face. If you watch that clip, you can see, depending on the clip you're showing, whether or not the east penthouse begins the collapse.
Michael Berger,
and yet, Michael, let me finish though. And yet, the building does not collapse to the south in the direction of the damage. It collapses straight down symmetrically in 6.6 seconds.
I got to move on because our time's limited.
Again, what you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself.
Describe that.
Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Let's just stay with this photograph for this graphic for just a second. Well, no, there's number 7 coming down. When you think that part of the component of news coverage around the country every year is the excitement and the fun that people get watching an old building being demolished, and they wire it very carefully for days. And it's a very careful operation in order to make sure that a building comes down safely. I think the last one we saw was when they brought down one of the old casinos in Las Vegas. I mean, this is just stunning to see these things come down.
There must be other examples if fires brought these buildings down. There were no examples. The probability that one of these buildings would come down due to fire, I mean, just looking at other buildings that have had fires and haven't collapsed, you know, of which there are hundreds of examples. So your probability is already 1 in perhaps 400 or 500. 3 buildings on the same day, I mean, just that one statistic, well, it's 400 times 400 times 400. You know, it's just a very small number already, the probability. And then for it to come down symmetrically, I mean, that again, the probability for that is more likely it will tip over. See, so that's the more. So what's the probability that somehow all 3 buildings come straight down?
Galileo's law of falling bodies calculates the time in which an object will travel a certain distance in complete freefall. Distance, d, equals 16.8 times time in seconds squared. The South Tower was 1,362 feet tall. 1362 equals 16.08 times 84.7, or 9.2 seconds. The Twin Towers came down in nearly free fall speed. (9:59), New York City, New York. The South Tower of the World Trade Center collapses to the ground in approximately 10 seconds. 29 minutes later, the North Tower follows suit, collapsing in approximately 10 seconds. Later that evening at 5:20, World Trade Center 7, a 47-story office building 300 feet away from the North Tower, suddenly collapses. The building's tenants included the CIA, Department of Defense, IRS, Secret Service, and Rudy Giuliani's emergency bunker. And the SEC was using it to store 3,000 to 4,000 files related to numerous Wall Street investigations. Although every single building surrounding Building 7 stood intact, it fell straight down into a convenient little pile in 6 seconds. Official explanation? Falling debris from the Twin Towers created an internal fire, which ignited several fuel tanks inside the building. If this is true, then it would be the 3rd building in history to collapse because of a fire. The first 2 would be the Twin Towers. On July 28, 1945, a B-52 bomber lost in the fog crashed into the 79th floor of the Empire State Building. 14 people dead, $1 million in damage, but the building stands intact to this day. On February 14, 1975, a 3-alarm fire broke out between the 9th and 14th floors of the North Tower. According to the New York Times, the fire leads to intense scrutiny of the towers and eventually to a decision to install sprinklers. On May 4, 1988, a 62-story skyscraper in Los Angeles burned for 3 hours and spread over 4 floors. It did not collapse. On February 23, 1991, a 38-story skyscraper in Philadelphia, built in 1973, burned for more than 19 hours and spread over 8 floors. It did not collapse. On October 17, 2004, a 56-story skyscraper in Venezuela, built in 1976, burned for over 17 hours and spread over 26 floors, eventually reaching the roof. Guess what? It did not collapse. On February 12, 2005, the Windsor Building in Madrid, a 32-story tower framed in steel-reinforced concrete, burned for almost 24 hours, completely eradicating the upper 10 stories of the building. Although the top 10 floors of the building fell, the building itself did not collapse. And yet, on September 11th, 2001, two 110-story skyscrapers, completed in 1973, burned for 56 and 103 minutes, respectively, over 4 floors, before collapsing completely to the ground. Do you still think that jet fuel brought down the World Trade Center? In all the videos of the collapses, explosions can be seen bursting from the building 20 to 30 stories below the demolition wave. Here, 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 and here. For more than a year, the Port Authority blocked the release of a tape of firefighters' transmissions from the World Trade Center on 9/11. In November 2002, the tape was finally released to the New York Times and other news outlets. Why did it take so long to get the tape released?
I got an eyewitness who said there was an explosion on floor 7-8. 7-8. We just had another explosion.
Warren Street because of the secondary explosion. We've got numerous people covered with dust from the secondary explosion.
And we got another explosion on the tower, 1013.
Number 2 has had a major explosion and what appears to be a complete collapse surrounding the entire area.
Who's involved in the secondary explosion at Tower 1? I've got 5.
Chief Palmer had reached the fire on the 78th floor of the South Tower and devised a plan to put it out.
I saw the pockets of fire. We should be able to knock it down with 2 lines. Where you know that? 78th floor, numerous 1045 call horns.
If the 78th floor was a raging inferno like the government would have us believe, then Palmer wouldn't have gotten as far as he did, and certainly wouldn't have been able to put it out. On August 12, 2005, an additional 15 hours of radio transmissions and transcripts of interviews with firefighters was finally released to the public. Firefighters described 2 events consistent with a controlled demolition: bright flashes from inside the building and a number of crackling sounds before the buildings collapsed. So what happened in the North Tower? Ask Willie Rodriguez. Willie, a janitor who worked in the World Trade Center for 20 years, was in sub-level 1 when the North Tower was hit.
And all of a sudden we hear boom! I thought it was a generator that blew up in the basement. And I said to myself, oh my God, I think it's a generator. And I was going to verbalize it. When I finished saying that in my mind, I hear boom! Right on the top, pretty far away. So it was a difference between coming from the basement and coming from the top. And that's, everybody started screaming. And a person comes running into the office saying, explosion, explosion, explosion. He got his hand extended, and all the skin was pulled from his under his arm, all the way to the top of the fingertips, and he was hanging on both arms. Hanging and hanging. And then I look at his face, and he was missing parts on his face. And I said, what happened? What happened? And he said, the elevators, the elevators.
Ginny Carr was attending a business meeting on the 36th floor of One Liberty Plaza, across the street from the World Trade Center, and caught the entire first attack on tape.
Sally, some crash.
The windows in the lobby of the North Tower were blown out, and marble panels were blown off of the walls. Mark Loiseau, the president of Controlled Demolition Incorporated, told the American Free Press that in the basements of the World Trade Center, where 47 central support columns connected to the bedrock, hot spots of literally molten steel were discovered more than a month after September 11th. These incredibly hot areas were found at the bottoms of the elevator shafts, down 7 basement levels. The molten steel was found 3, 4, and 5 weeks later when the rubble was being removed. He said that molten steel was also found at World Trade Center 7. The highest temperature was in the east corner of the South Tower, where a temperature of 1,377 degrees Fahrenheit was recorded. The molten steel in the basement was more than double that temperature.
And what's to explain, Governor, the smoke that still comes out of the fire?
There's still fire down below. There is such an incredibly deep pile of rubble, and the tower goes down 5-6 stories underground, that there's still fire underneath, smoldering.
And pools of molten steel were found beneath the rubble.
This is how it's been since day one. Oh, it's unbelievable. And this is 6 weeks later, almost 6 weeks later. And as we get closer to the center of this, it gets hotter and hotter. It's probably 1,500 degrees. We've had some small windows into what we thought was a core at some point, and it looked like an oven. You know, it was just roaring inside. It was just a bright, reddish-orange color.
These and even more effects point to the existence of very powerful, precisely placed explosives.
Okay. I studied physics at MIT. I did electrical engineering for about 8 years. I've had quite a bit of practical engineering experience. When I first saw the collapses, I was absolutely convinced that they were not spontaneous. One of the first things that I did was to speak with one of my patients, who was a retired Army Corps of Engineers fellow who's done a lot of demolition and construction. Showed him some of the public source videos that are available of it, and he immediately pointed out that there were squibs, which represent little puffs of smoke essentially coming out of the buildings initially. which were clearly a sign of controlled demolition. He had no opinions beyond that, but he said without doubt that it was controlled demolition. That sort of set me on the path of continuing to examine it and trying to gather as much evidence as I could. You know, the obvious question is what does it mean that there was a controlled demolition? At the simplest level, it means that someone had a lot of access to the buildings over a long enough period of time to set this up. The initial FEMA report basically acknowledged that the kerosene would have burned off very quickly. What wasn't destroyed in the initial fireball would have been consumed fairly rapidly and would have only really served as an ignition for the rest of the material. And the second point being that the fuel here really was strictly office contents. If you think of a modern office with copying machines, computers, and as has been previously mentioned, the smoke, particularly from building 2 just before it collapsed, was very black looking. This is generally an indication of an inefficient fire in which there's not enough oxygen for the amount of fuel. These types of fires typically burn very cool. They are not hot flames like blowtorches. The cores themselves, basically, if you've seen diagrams of the building, there's a large central rectangle in each of the towers that contained 47 columns. And these columns basically were the primary structural support of the building. They were given the role of supporting the whole gravitational load of the building. Since they were so strong, it would have been reasonable to think that they would have withstood, at least to some extent, the collapse. But in fact, as we see after the buildings collapsed, there was basically only little stubs of these things standing up a floor or 2 above the ground level. The cores did not have much in them that would burn. The cores basically were dedicated to things like elevator shafts, utility shafts, stairways. So you have drywall material, you have a little bit of carpeting, you don't really have any inflammable material in the core itself. Okay, as far as the issue of what failed and how, some of the initial suggestions, and these showed up in the NOVA documentary, which is a good example of what I like to call proof by computer animation. Thomas Egar, who was a material scientist but not a structural engineer, who became a spokesman for these documentaries, indicated that the floors had somehow failed, that the trusses supporting the floors had failed. This was the theory that was put forward actually in the initial FEMA report. Subsequently, there have been basically complete contradictions of that. Jim Hoffman has done quite a bit of research which is available on the web concerning the problems with this idea that the floors would have simply fallen. There was a study done by Weidlinger Associates. The chief engineer there was Mathis Levy, who's a very well-known authority on building collapses. He specifically disavowed the idea of pancaking or collapsing of the floors. And the most recent official report we have on this, which is from the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, NIST, rejected the idea that floor collapse was part of it. And so as a result, we have basically no sequential model at this point. What NIST has suggested is that there was some kind of simultaneous collapse of the cores, but they have not attempted to give any kind of modeling as to whether those cores could have in fact been destroyed by the fires in the way that they claim. Unfortunately, the material that would have allowed a detailed fire analysis, the actual physical evidence, is all gone. One of the most significant things to my thinking that indicates that this could not have been the sort of collapse that we are told it was is the presence of the dust clouds. And as you've seen in the pictures, and I'm sure all of us have seen probably more than we would like, there were very, very large clouds of very thick dust that enveloped the area, that crossed the river, that made it almost all the way to New Jersey from the pictures that I've seen. This type of flow is something that we are familiar with in physics. It occurs in only 2 situations that we know of naturally. One is in volcanic eruptions where a large amount of material is suddenly exploded into the air and basically forms small particles. The other situation is something called turbidity currents. These occur along the edges of the continental shelves where mud or sediment will slump, become suspended in water. And the common thread is that you have large amounts of a dense material that is suspended very quickly in a fluid, thereby creating another denser fluid which is in effect the dust cloud, and that fluid can achieve considerable velocities. The problem with creating this sort of slurry of fine particles is that there really is no mechanism that has been proposed. We have concrete floors with carpeting or flooring over them. We have furniture. We have floors basically that are coming together in a collapse, but the concrete is basically protected under these layers. Early in the collapse, in the very first moments, we see these thick clouds being ejected at very high speed. They're clearly dense because they flow downward and become part of this large overall pyroclastic flow. What we're basically being told is that the concrete sort of jumped up into midair, exploded itself, and then was ejected as the floors came together. Not a very plausible mechanism, but I have yet to hear of anything else proposed to explain it. From quite a few people on the scene, we've been told that the powder it represented most of the concrete, that the amount of intact macroscopic chunks of concrete on the scene were negligible, that basically everything was reduced to powder. And incidentally, we also know that other things besides concrete were reduced to powder. We know that contents of computers, exotic metals from computer chips, these sorts of things were also identified in the dust and in very small particles, generally on the order of less than 100 microns in diameter. So we have a real issue of mechanism as far as what in the process of this collapse could cause so many things to be pulverized so finely. For the towers to collapse the way we saw them collapse basically implies that the columns simply collapsed into themselves. They telescoped straight down. Steel keeps a lot of its structural integrity even when heated. Until you begin to approach the melting point, you don't really see a catastrophic loss of strength, and this is what we're talking about. We're talking about basically vertical box columns collapsing into themselves, which implies a complete loss of mechanical strength. And as far as the initial impacts, this recent NIST study made an interesting point about World Trade Centers. The film analysis showed that it oscillated for about 4 minutes after it was struck by the airplane, and the oscillation rate was identical to what would be expected for the intact tower. World Trade 1 began collapsing from the very top after an hour and 40 minutes. It's very hard to imagine office contents progressively heating up hotter and hotter over that period of time. And for a building to collapse from the very top, which is the least heavily loaded, is also very odd, to say the least. Just a couple of other anomalies. As we know, there were reports of explosions. There were reports of underground explosions in both of the towers at the time of the impact from a building engineer by the name of Philip Morelli. There are interviews with him on the web. From the Naudet brothers film, 9/11, we see that the lobby of the North Tower was extensively damaged with what looks like high explosive blast damage, and this was immediately after the plane collision. But we know that on the weekend before there were power downs, and there appear to have been evacuation drills going on throughout the previous week, which suggests that at least some people knew that something was happening. The power downs may represent a time window in which demolition charges would have been planted, although I think it's possible that they also were planted over a much longer period of time, given the relative accessibility of the buildings.
Scott Forbes, he joins us from across the pond today. Scott, thank you for making time for us.
You're very welcome. Hello.
Let's see, where do we start here? We don't have a lot of time, but I think what we should do first off is, just tell us maybe what the atmosphere was leading up to 9/11, exactly what your job was and what you did there in the World Trade Center towers.
Sure. I worked for, as you said, Fiduciary Trust in the South Tower. I was based on the 97th floor, where our data center was. About 3 weeks prior to 9/11, our company, along with many others in the towers, were given notice that there was going to be a power down in the top 50% of floors in the Southern Tower. This was unprecedented. As you can imagine, a lot of financial institutions in the building, and to have a complete loss of power meant a complete loss of systems. And for an organization like my company, it was truly extraordinary.
I mean, people probably scrambling as soon as they could to secure their systems before the power down.
Yep, that was part of the deal.
Have there been, let me, because for the sake of time, I want to keep this moving as much as possible, Scott. Have there been any power downs like this? Again, you were notified by the Port Authority there'd be a 36-hour power down of the top half of your tower. Have there been anything like this prior to this particular power down? And exactly, give us a time frame of when you were notified about the power down as related to 9/11. What was the date of the power down, and had there been one prior to this?
Okay, the power down was on the Saturday and Sunday prior to 9/11, so that would have been the 8th and 9th of September. We were given 3 weeks' notice. It was relatively short time notice period to make all the preparations needed. And it was unprecedented. We've never experienced a power down in the towers as far as I am aware. I had worked in the towers from 1998. My colleagues who had been in the building well beyond that could not remember an occasion such as this, apart from the bomb incident in the early 90s.
Well, let's move to this, Scott, because now the power has been down, and you see a number of maintenance workers coming into the building. What was in your mind suspicious or notably suspicious about some of these workers coming in to come in for the power down?
Actually, at the time, I wasn't suspicious at all. It was just part of the fact that there was a power down and that there were workers in overalls in the building.
But looking back now, you noticed that there was some suspicious behavior with these workers.
Well, of course, looking back, you question everything, and you wonder, well, one of the main reasons why I became suspicious was I got in touch with the Port Authority, and I got in touch with the 9/11 Commission to register this piece of information so that it would be acknowledged. If only to be thrown away. And I had no acknowledgement. They did not come back to me. I repeatedly called and wrote letters to them. I've had no acknowledgement. It's as if this information is of no interest to anyone, but to me it seems to be part of the puzzle and should be registered. I was not in the office on 9/11 because of working that weekend. I had the day off on the Tuesday. And so I was in my apartment, which overlooked the Trade Center. I lived in Jersey City, across the river from the towers, so I was eyewitness to what went on there. And as soon as I saw the first tower go down, the South Tower, I was highly suspicious. It just didn't look correct. It looked like a controlled demolition. It did not look like a building collapsing either from an aircraft hitting it or from a fire inside. It seemed to crumble into dust.
Yeah.
It just didn't ring true.
So what was the cause of the devastating explosive failure that happened to the World Trade Center?
Then we saw secondary explosions and then subsequent collapses.
We heard reports of secondary explosions after the aircraft impacted.
The entire building has just collapsed, as if a demolition team set off. When you see the old demolitions of these old buildings, it folded down on itself.
Anybody who's ever watched a building being demolished on purpose knows that if you're going to do this, you have to get at the under infrastructure of a building and bring it down.
Like, it sounded like gunfire, bang, 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 and then all of a sudden 3 big explosions.